For almost all of human history, sleeping straight through the whole night without waking up would have been strange. The idea of closing your eyes once and staying asleep until morning is a modern thing, not an ancient one. For most of the last 200,000 years, our species lived in darkness without any artificial light. We were surrounded by changing temperatures, faraway sounds, and a quiet need to stay alert. Sleep came in pieces, not in one long unbroken stretch. It went up and down, with the fire, with the moon, with the breathing of other people nearby. If our ancestors slept in 3 separate parts across the night, shaped by their surroundings and their bodies, what changed about the world we live in? And why did humans sleep in 3 parts for 200,000 years? Before artificial light, before mechanical clocks, before cities glowed against the dark sky, night was not an empty space waiting to be filled with 8 straight hours of sleep. For most of the roughly 200,000 years that Homo sapiens has existed, darkness came slowly and completely, changing the world in ways that made sleeping through the whole night unlikely. When the sun went down, the temperature dropped, the air changed, and the sounds of things moving in the distance became easier to hear. In open grasslands, at the edges of forests, and later in caves or simple shelters, humans lived inside a living world that did not go quiet just because the sky turned black. The night carried wind, insects, predators, and the small movements of other humans shifting their bodies near a shared fire. In a place like that, sleep could not be seen as a shot of state. It was part of a bigger natural rhythm. The earliest members of our species inherited body clocks that were shaped long before Homo sapiens appeared. These were systems that evolved under steady cycles of light and dark across millions of years of mammalian history. These internal clocks, guided by light and temperature, did not tell the body to fall into one solid block of unconsciousness. Instead, they organized waves of sleepiness and alertness that rose and fell across the night. In regions near the equator, where early humans spent much of their time, darkness lasted close to 12 hours each night throughout the year. 12 hours is longer than how long most people sleep today. Yet archaeological and observational evidence suggests that people did not spend all of that time fully asleep. Firelight extended how far they could see only a little. Its glow flickered and cast moving shadows, never strong enough to fully push away the darkness. The human eye adjusted to low light, but details were still hard to see. Under these conditions, waking up briefly was not a problem. It was a normal shift between stages of sleep. Body temperature naturally falls after the sun goes down, reaching its lowest point in the middle of the night before slowly rising again. This natural temperature pattern helps deep sleep come soon after dark, followed by lighter sleep and a greater chance of waking up as the night goes on. For people living without artificial light, this pattern would have been made stronger, not weaker. The first stretch of sleep probably began fairly soon after full darkness arrived, when activity around the fire slowed down and the body needed less energy. After several hours, a partial waking would have lined up with the body's natural internal shift. In small groups, not everyone would have woken up at exactly the same time. Differences in age, health, and individual sleep tendencies would spread periods of alertness across the group. From an evolutionary point of view, this scattered pattern had advantages. A group where some members were likely awake at different times was less vulnerable to predators or sudden dangers without needing formal guard shifts. Even babies and older adults, whose sleep tends to break apart more easily, helped with this shared watchfulness without even trying. The environment, the body's way of managing temperature, and the inherited structure of mammalian sleep cycles all came together to create nights that unfolded in phases rather than one long drop into unconsciousness. Night was like a tide moving in and out. When we picture our ancestors sleeping in 3 parts, we are not forcing a strict schedule onto the past. We are simply recognizing that in a world run only by firelight and moonlight, continuous 8-hour sleep would have been the unusual case, not the normal one. The question then is not whether humans are able to sleep in one solid block, but whether that kind of sleep reflects the conditions under which our species first learned to rest in the dark. If we step closer to what life was actually like for early Homo sapiens, the shape of the night becomes more real. Imagine a small group resting near the fading embers of a fire at the edge of an African grassland about 100,000 years ago. The fire is not a wall against the dark. It is a circle of warmth, maybe a few meters wide, beyond which the land stays mostly hidden. The sky above is not polluted by artificial light, so the stars are sharp and clear. In this setting, awareness, doesn't fully shut down. Even in sleep, the human brain keeps listening for sounds, watching for temperature changes, and noticing small shifts in the surroundings. This partial alertness is not a flaw. It reflects a deep connection to earlier primates whose survival depended on being able to switch quickly from rest to full attention. Mammalian sleep is organized into repeating cycles that go back and forth between deeper non-REM stages and lighter phases where waking up is easier. These cycles last about 90 minutes in adults today, and there is little reason to think their basic structure was different tens of thousands of years ago. Over the course of a long tropical night, several of these cycles would naturally happen. After 2 or 3 cycles, the chance of waking up on its own goes up. In a modern bedroom, insulated and quiet, this brief waking may go unnoticed or feel annoying. At a Stone Age campsite, it would have been part of the normal rhythm. The fire might be stirred. A few quiet words might be shared. Someone might add fuel to keep warm. The body, having released some of the built-up sleep pressure during the first phase, would be biologically ready for a calm period of wakefulness before going back to sleep. Environmental pressures reinforced this structure. Predators, like large cats, were mostly active at night. Even if direct attacks were rare, the possibility of danger shaped behavior across generations. A group where sleep was naturally broken up would never be completely unconscious all at once. And importantly, this didn't require planning or assigned shifts. Natural differences within the group were enough. Teenagers often have later sleep tendencies while older adults tend to wake earlier. Babies wake often. These differences create a changing pattern of alertness that, over evolutionary time, could have lowered the chance of danger. Archaeological sites with fire pits arranged at the center of shelters suggest that life at night revolved around controlled fire rather than total withdrawal into darkness. Yet the limited brightness of firelight means that after a period of wakefulness, darkness and cooling temperatures would again make sleep easier. The body's internal clock, controlled by the suprachiasmatic nucleus in response to light, would not have been thrown off by brief firelight the way it is today by electric lights. Fire gives off relatively low levels of blue wavelength light compared to modern screens and LEDs, and blue light is especially powerful in stopping the release of melatonin, the hormone that makes you sleepy. As a result, going back to sleep after a middle of the night waking would have been much easier in ancient settings. Over many generations, the human nervous system adapted not to a rigid 8-hour block, but to a night that ebbed and flowed. The idea of 3 phases does not mean they were all equal in length. Instead, it points to an early solid segment of sleep, a natural waking window, and a later segment before dawn. Such a pattern matches both mammalian sleep structure and the environmental realities of the late Ice Age. When we consider that our species spent the vast majority of its time in this kind of setting, the expectation of perfectly uninterrupted sleep starts to look less like a biological truth and more like a cultural habit placed on top of a much older design. As dawn approached in prehistoric environments, the structure of the night showed its final change. Long before the sun became visible, small shifts had already begun. Air temperature had reached its lowest point and then slowly started to rise. The darkness shifted from pure black to a softer gray. Birds, sensitive to tiny increases in light, began to cool. For humans whose bodies evolved within these signals, the final phase of sleep unfolded under the influence of rising cortisol levels and a slow drop in melatonin. This hormonal shift did not happen all at once. It was a gradual recalibration, getting muscles ready for movement and sharpening awareness before full daylight came. In this kind of setting, the last segment of sleep was often lighter and more open to outside sounds and inner thoughts. Dreams in this period may have been easier to remember, not because ancient minds were different, but because waking followed closely after lighter REM sleep stages. The environment itself shaped how long this final rest lasted. In equatorial Africa, where the amount of daylight barely changes across seasons, sunrise came at a predictable time. There was little benefit to staying in deep sleep once light began to spread. Hunting, gathering, and working together required early movement, especially before the heat of midday made things harder. This pattern reinforced a 3-part structure: an early drop into deeper sleep after dark, a middle interval of partial waking during the night, and a final lighter segment before dawn. None of these phases needed clocks or conscious planning. They were built into the connection between human biology and the turning of the planet. Archaeological evidence from late Ice Age campsites shows repeated use of the same locations, suggesting that nighttime routines were stable across generations. Hearth remains, tool placements, and clustered sleeping areas suggest that nights were organized but not rigid. When groups returned to familiar sites, the same environmental signals guided their rest. The predictable arrival of dawn would have anchored the closing phase of sleep across tens of thousands of years, and this structure held up across different landscapes, whether in open grassland, forest edges, or later in Ice Age Europe where nights were longer in winter. The basic principle stayed the same. Longer darkness at higher latitudes may have stretched the interval between phases, but the body's need for sleep does not simply expand to fill all available darkness. After several hours of deep sleep, the drive for rest lessens, making waking up on its own more likely even when night continues. In colder climates, this middle waking period may have served practical purposes, adjusting blankets, tending to embers, keeping the body warm. When sleep returned, it did so against the backdrop of environmental limits rather than artificial light. Over 200,000 years, this repeating relationship between biology and the turning earth shaped the human nervous system's expectations at a deep level. The human brain became used to nights that were active rather than uniform. Memory building, emotional processing, and hormonal balance all unfolded within this phase structure. When morning finally arrived, waking up was not a sudden break from a sealed block of unconsciousness, but the closing moment of a sequence already in motion. If we trace this pattern back to the earliest appearance of our species in Africa, it becomes hard to argue that continuous 8-hour sleep was the original design. Instead, the ancestral night appears layered, shaped by temperature curves, the presence of predators, social differences, and the gradual approach of dawn. The three-phase model is not a romantic reconstruction. It is a reflection of how human biology and ancient environments fit together across evolutionary time. When modern people wake up in the middle of the night and look at a glowing clock in the dark, the experience is often labeled as a problem. The word insomnia comes to mind quickly. Yet if we step back from electric light and rigid schedules, a different explanation becomes possible. The human body carries an internal timing system that did not start in bedrooms with insulated walls. It was formed across hundreds of thousands of years in environments where darkness lasted many hours, and the need for sleep rose and fell in waves rather than as a single command. The circadian rhythm, anchored in the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus, syncs up with light entering the eye. As daylight fades, melatonin production increases, lowering alertness and preparing the body for rest. However, melatonin does not stay at a constant high level throughout the entire night. It follows a curve, rising in the evening, stabilizing, then gradually falling toward morning. Alongside this, the body's need for sleep builds during wakefulness and fades after several hours of deep sleep. When these two systems interact, a predictable pattern appears after an initial period of solid rest. The combined forces of reduced sleep pressure and slight hormonal shifts can create a natural window of wakefulness. In laboratory conditions where participants are kept in long periods of darkness without artificial light, researchers have observed segmented sleep patterns. Individuals often fall asleep soon after night begins, sleep for several hours, wake calmly for a period, then go back to sleep until morning. This pattern shows up even without outside disturbance. It suggests that the ability for two-part or three-part nighttime sleep is still built into human biology. From a biological point of view, such segmented sleep is not inefficient. Mammalian sleep structure already divides the night into cycles of about 90 minutes, going back and forth between deeper non-REM stages and rapid eye movement phases associated with vivid dreaming. These cycles create natural internal boundaries. After multiple cycles, brief awakenings become statistically more likely. In modern settings, artificial light, social expectations, and anxiety about time often turn this natural boundary into distress. In ancestral settings, without clocks or deadlines before sunrise, a quiet waking interval would not have carried the same mental weight. Cortisol, often described simply as a stress hormone, also follows a daily rhythm. It begins to rise in the second half of the night, preparing the body for morning activity. This gradual increase can lead to lighter sleep toward dawn, combined with the body's temperature regulation, which reaches its lowest temperature in the middle of the night. Before climbing again, the body's biological environment subtly favors a phase structure. When we connect this to the conditions under which Homo sapiens evolved, the logic gets stronger. For most of our species' history, Darkness lasted longer than the total time humans needed in deep unconsciousness. After 4 or 5 hours, much of the body's sleep need would have been met. The nervous system, freed from the strongest sleep pressure, could enter a period of lighter awareness without compromising overall recovery. Over evolutionary time, individuals whose brains could handle such transitions without panic may have worked more effectively in nighttime environments. The tendency to wake briefly was not removed by natural selection because it did not necessarily hurt survival. Instead, it may have added to flexibility. In this light, the modern expectation of perfectly smooth sleep looks less like a universal biological standard and more like a cultural layer placed on top of a nervous system shaped in darker, quieter, and more varied nights. Human sleep is not a single uniform state. Even within what we call one night of rest, the brain moves through structured stages, each with different electrical patterns and physical effects. These stages repeat in cycles, usually lasting around 90 minutes, though it varies between people. During the early part of the night, slow-wave sleep dominates. This phase is marked by synchronized brain activity, a slower heart rate, and lower energy use. It is during this period that physical recovery, immune regulation, and growth hormone release are most active. As the night continues, the amount of rapid eye movement sleep increases, bringing more vivid dreaming and greater brain activity. The way these stages are spread out already implies that the night is divided into segments. After several cycles, the intensity of slow-wave sleep drops because much of the built-up sleep need has been met. When this biological release lines up with a slight rise in core body temperature and a gradual shift in hormonal balance, the chance of waking up naturally goes up. In modern society, brief awakenings are often seen as interruptions. Yet research on sleep under extended darkness has shown that when people are exposed to natural light cycles without artificial evening light, many develop a pattern where sleep divides into two big segments separated by a calm period of wakefulness. This waking interval can last from 30 minutes to over an hour, during which people report feeling reflective rather than upset. Importantly, these observations do not require cultural instruction. They come from the interaction between internal timing systems and environmental light exposure. The absence of artificial blue-rich light in ancestral nights would have preserved the natural rise and fall of melatonin. Firelight, with its warmer color and lower strength, has far less suppressive effect on this hormone. As a result, when ancient humans woke during the night, the hormonal environment was still supportive of going back to sleep. There was no sharp signal of daytime. The nervous system stayed in nighttime mode. From an evolutionary point of view, such flexibility would have been neutral or even helpful. A brain capable of transitioning gently between sleep and wake states without getting fully alert could respond to environmental signals and then re-enter rest. Over tens of thousands of years, this capacity would have remained stable because it did not hurt reproductive success. The expectation that sleep must be continuous to be restorative is relatively recent. Sleep studies show that even in modern individuals, brief awakenings happen many times each night, often lasting only seconds and going unnoticed. The difference lies in awareness. When the mind attaches worry to these awakenings, they become bigger. In a prehistoric setting without clocks, the same physical events would have happened without any interpretation. The structure of mammalian sleep cycles suggests that a night naturally contains internal boundaries. Rather than fighting these boundaries, ancestral humans likely moved with them. Over the 200-year span of Homo sapiens' existence, the brain structure did not fundamentally change. The swings between deep and light sleep, the hormonal patterns, and the temperature shifts remained consistent. What changed much later was the social framework surrounding them. When we consider that our internal sleep machinery still produces waves rather than a single flat line, the idea of three phases seems less like speculation and more like an extension of patterns already visible in laboratory recordings. The body has always slept in rhythms. The question is whether modern expectations have hidden a pattern that was once ordinary across the long arc of human evolution. Beyond laboratory measurements and hormonal curves, the biological argument for segmented sleep becomes clearer when we see how human sleep responds to the removal of modern constraints. In controlled settings where participants live without artificial evening light and without fixed wake times, their sleep often reorganizes itself. They do not consistently extend one solid block of unconsciousness to fill the entire period of darkness. Instead, after several nights of adjustment, A pattern can appear where an initial span of sleep is followed by a quiet interval of wakefulness, then a second span before morning. This shift does not require suggestion or instruction. It appears as a natural alignment between internal biology and natural light cycles. The meaning of this is not that every human must sleep in exactly 3 equal segments, but that the nervous system keeps the ability for phased rest when environmental conditions allow it. The biological foundation for this lies in the 2 systems that regulate sleep, which are the circadian timing system and the homeostatic drive. Circadian signals determine when sleep is most likely, guided by light exposure and the natural rhythm of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Homeostatic pressure builds the longer one stays awake, creating an increasing need for slow-wave sleep. After several hours of deep rest, this pressure drops significantly. If darkness continues long after the strongest sleep need has been satisfied, the body may enter a state of relative balance. In ancestral environments near the equator, nights often lasted around 12 hours. Deep physical recovery does not typically require that full duration. A gap between segments of sleep would therefore not represent a deficiency, but a recalibration. Core body temperature provides another clue. It drops after sunset, reaching a low point roughly in the middle of the night, then gradually rises. This temperature low point aligns with the deepest portion of sleep. As temperature begins to climb, the brain becomes slightly more excitable. Waking becomes easier, especially after multiple completed sleep cycles. From the perspective of evolutionary continuity, there is no sign that Homo sapiens experienced a fundamentally different temperature regulation pattern from modern humans. The same circadian swings govern their nights over the roughly 200,000 years since our species emerged in Africa. These swings remain stable because they are deeply rooted in mammalian biology. What is different now is the artificial extension of daylight through electric lights and digital screens that give off high levels of blue light. Such exposure delays the onset of melatonin and squeezes the available darkness into fewer hours. When darkness is shortened, sleep is forced into a narrow window, increasing the likelihood of one consolidated block. In earlier conditions, when darkness was plentiful and unbroken by bright light, the nervous system had space to express its natural ups and downs. Even today, large-scale studies suggest that spontaneous nighttime awakenings are common and often harmless. Many individuals who say they sleep through the night still experience brief periods of arousal without remembering them. The difference between a problem and a pattern often lies in interpretation and environment rather than in biology alone. When we consider that for the vast majority of human existence, nights unfolded without artificial light, fixed schedules, or anxiety about productivity, the persistence of a hidden capacity for segmented sleep seems unsurprising. The architecture of the human brain was not designed exclusively for a single uninterrupted stretch of rest. It was shaped in ecosystems where darkness lasted long enough for sleep to ebb and flow. If this phased capacity remains built within us, it invites a reconsideration of whether modern sleep norms represent biological necessity or cultural adaptation, placed on top of an older design. Long before sleep became a subject of laboratory measurement, it was described in everyday language. Written records from pre-industrial societies contain references that are hard to explain if we assume that people always slept in one uninterrupted block. In several European texts from the late medieval and early modern periods, phrases appear that distinguish between a first sleep and a second sleep. These references are not rare poetic expressions. They appear in diaries, medical manuals, legal records, and religious writings. Individuals describe going to bed after dark, rising after their first sleep for a period of quiet activity, and then returning to bed for a second stretch before dawn. This pattern was not described as unusual. It was mentioned casually as part of the ordinary rhythm of night. Such records do not reach back to 100,000 years, yet they provide a bridge between documented history and deeper evolutionary reasoning. If segmented sleep was common only a few centuries ago before artificial lighting became widespread, it becomes believable that the pattern reflects older biological tendencies rather than a short-lived cultural habit. In farming-era Europe, winter nights were long, often exceeding 14 hours at higher latitudes. Without electric light, people relied on candles or fireplace fires that gave limited illumination. After sunset, social activity gradually slowed down. The first period of sleep began relatively early. Historical accounts describe individuals waking naturally after several hours, sometimes to pray, talk quietly, tend to animals, or simply lie in quiet thought. This interval did not carry the urgency that modern nighttime awakenings often produce. There were no lit-up clocks to count the minutes. The night was still thick and quiet. After this in-between period, people went back to bed for their second sleep until morning light signaled the start of work. The words themselves, first sleep and second sleep, suggest recognition of two distinct segments rather than one continuous experience. Medical writers of the period occasionally advised that certain remedies be taken between these sleeps, implying that the interval was predictable enough to plan around. Importantly, this structure was not limited to one region. Variations of similar descriptions appear in other parts of Europe and beyond. While the written record is uneven, the reappearance of segmented language shows that consolidated 8-hour sleep was not universally assumed even in relatively recent centuries, when gas lighting expanded in urban centers during the 18th and 19th centuries. Evenings grew brighter and more socially active. Bedtime shifted later. The interval between dark and sleep grew longer, compressing the available darkness. Over time, references to first and second sleep declined in written sources. The change was gradual, running alongside technological and economic transformation. This historical shift aligns with the biological argument. When darkness becomes shorter or less complete, the opportunity for phased sleep diminishes. The significance of these documents lies not in nostalgia, but in continuity. They show that segmented sleep was widespread enough to enter common vocabulary. If such a pattern continued into early modern Europe, thousands of years after the emergence of Homo sapiens, it likely echoes a structure far older than the texts themselves. Written history offers only a narrow window. Yet within that window, we glimpse a night divided into recognizable parts. The deeper question remains whether this division reflects a cultural habit that emerged under specific conditions or a long-standing alignment between human biology and the natural span of darkness that shaped our species from the beginning. When historians examine references to first sleep and second sleep, they do not rely on a single source or isolated quote. The pattern appears across different types of writing and social classes, suggesting it reflected common practice rather than elite theory. Court records from early modern Europe include testimony where witnesses describe events that happened after their first sleep. Religious writings tell believers to use the waking interval for prayer or quiet thought. Medical texts occasionally recommend specific treatments to be taken between the two sleeps, assuming that readers would understand the timing without further explanation. The language is practical, not symbolic. No author stops to explain what first sleep means, which suggests a shared understanding. This absence of explanation is itself evidence. If segmented sleep were rare, writers would likely have needed to define it. Instead, it functioned as a simple marker of time. The historical record does not claim that every person followed identical patterns. Variability has always existed. Yet, the consistent recognition of two distinct nighttime segments suggests that continuous 8-hour sleep was not the unquestioned standard in societies that lacked widespread artificial lighting. From the perspective of environmental history, this makes sense. Before widespread street lights and domestic electric bulbs, darkness put limits on activity. Even in urban centers, most people went to bed soon after dark during winter months, when 10 to 14 hours of darkness were available. The biological capacity for two large sleep periods could express itself without being squeezed. When individuals woke after several hours, the night was still deep and quiet. Without clocks to calculate lost time, the interval carried little anxiety. Some accounts describe couples speaking softly, neighbors visiting briefly, or individuals engaging in quiet reflection. These descriptions align with the phase structure suggested by human sleep biology, and importantly, as gas lamps and later electric lights expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries, references to segmented sleep diminished. Evening entertainment, factory schedules, and standardized work hours pushed bedtimes later. Darkness itself shortened as streets and indoor spaces brightened. Historical language reflects this transition. The phrase first sleep gradually disappeared from common use. This decline runs alongside technological change rather than a documented biological shift. The human brain did not undergo rapid evolution during these few centuries. Instead, environmental conditions changed the way existing sleep structure expressed itself. When artificial light extends perceived daytime, melatonin onset is delayed. People go to bed later, but still wake at socially required hours. compressing total sleep into one consolidated block. Over time, this pattern becomes culturally reinforced and medically defined as normal. Looking back across written history, the earlier segmentation appears less like an oddity and more like a familiar alignment between long nights and flexible biology. If we project this alignment further into the past, into the tens of thousands of years before written language, the plausibility grows. For roughly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived without electric lights. The historical documents from pre-industrial Europe do not prove how Stone Age communities slept, yet they reveal that when modern constraints are removed, human sleep readily divides into recognizable phases. The disappearance of first and second sleep from common speech happened alongside technological transformation, not with new brain structures. This continuity suggests that segmented sleep may represent a lasting capacity shaped long before recorded history began. The historical references to segmented sleep do not stand alone as isolated curiosities. They align with broader patterns in pre-industrial life that shaped how nights were structured across generations. In rural communities, work was governed by daylight rather than fixed mechanical schedules. Seasonal variation influenced both labor and rest. During winter months in higher latitudes, darkness extended for many hours beyond the amount of sleep the body needed for recovery. In such conditions, the distinction between an early and a later sleep segment becomes easy to understand. Anthropologists and social historians have noted that pre-industrial households often treated the waking interval between sleeps as an ordinary extension of home life. This interval was neither fully public nor fully private. It existed in a quiet, in-between space, calm and dimly lit, yet not driven by the urgency of morning. The existence of this practice into the early modern period suggests that human sleep kept its flexibility long after farming, city life, and written language had emerged. If segmented sleep continued thousands of years after the Neolithic shift, it is unlikely to have originated suddenly in medieval Europe. Rather, it appears to reflect a deeper biological inheritance interacting with available darkness. From an evolutionary perspective, the continuity is striking. Homo sapiens emerged in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago and spent the overwhelming majority of that time in environments without artificial nighttime lighting. For most of this span, the daily cycle of light and dark was decided only by the sun, moon, and fire. The nervous system that evolved under these conditions is the same system modern humans have today. While cultural practices shift rapidly over centuries, the architecture of the brain changes slowly across evolutionary time. The historical documentation of first and second sleep therefore works as a window into what may have been an ancient pattern rather than a short-lived custom. It reveals that when nights remain long and not compressed by artificial light, human sleep can express its internal segmentation without distress. As industrialization progressed, evening light extended social activity and economic demand standardized wake times. The waking interval between sleeps gradually lost its place in daily life. Over time, medical thinking reframed nighttime awakenings as disturbances rather than phases. This reframing did not happen alongside a sudden transformation of circadian biology. Instead, it reflected the growing value placed on efficiency and uninterrupted productivity. In this context, the disappearance of segmented sleep from common vocabulary represents a cultural shift placed on top of stable biology. The written record, though limited in scope and geography, supports the argument that consolidated 8-hour sleep is not the only natural arrangement available to the human brain. When we trace the timeline backward beyond medieval Europe into the deep past of our species, the plausibility grows stronger. For approximately 200,000 years, humans moved through nights shaped by darkness, dropping temperatures, and environmental uncertainty. The persistence of phased sleep in relatively recent history suggests that this pattern may echo the conditions under which our ancestors first learned to rest. The historical lens does not provide direct observation of Stone Age camps, yet it bridges the gap between present expectations and ancient possibility. It invites us to reconsider whether the modern model of continuous sleep reflects biological necessity or the squeezing of a more flexible design, one that was forged over the long arc of human evolution. Archaeology does not preserve sleep directly. It leaves behind no fossil of a dream, no imprint of a waking interval. Yet the way ancient campsites were arranged offers indirect clues about how nights may have unfolded across Africa, Europe, and parts of Asia. Excavations of late Ice Age sites reveal repeating patterns. a central hearth surrounded by activity zones, clusters of stone tools, and areas thought to be resting spaces. These arrangements suggest that nighttime life revolved around shared firelight rather than separate sleeping compartments. A hearth was not only a source of warmth and cooking, it was the center point of evening gathering. Its glow created a boundary between visible and unseen space. In such an environment, sleep would have occurred close to others, within hearing range of shifting embers and the breathing of companions. This closeness has implications for how a phased night might function. If individuals naturally woke after several hours, they would not have risen into silence, but into a muted social space. The archaeological record shows that hearths were often carefully maintained with layers of ash indicating repeated tending across nights and seasons. Fire needs attention. Even without formal assignment, someone would need to adjust fuel, stir embers, or prevent sparks from spreading. A segmented pattern of sleep spread unevenly among group members would make this maintenance easier without organized shifts. Variation in age and physical condition would ensure that at least one or two individuals were lightly awake at different points from a population structure perspective. This scattered alertness could reduce danger without requiring continuous full wakefulness from any single person. Archaeological evidence of repeated campsite use also implies predictability in nightly routines. When groups return to familiar shelters or open-air sites, the placement of hearths and sleeping areas likely followed established habits. Over generations, these spatial habits would strengthen consistent patterns of rest. In open grassland environments, where visibility extended outward from the fire in a limited radius, the darkness beyond would remain alive with nocturnal life. The faint sounds of insects, distant animal movement, and shifting wind would not go away just because humans lay down. A phased sleep structure with intermittent waking fits well with such ecological conditions. Importantly, there is no sign in the archaeological record of enclosed, insulated sleeping chambers anything like modern bedrooms. Even in caves, air flow and temperature changes were constant. The human body, responding to cooling air and changing firelight, would not remain in an unbroken deep state for the entire span of darkness. Over roughly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens adjusted behaviorally to these environments without altering basic sleep biology. The archaeological landscape therefore supports the idea that nights were dynamic rather than static. The arrangement of half-centered camps suggests collective rest punctuated by small movements, quiet exchanges, and the practical maintenance of warmth. While we cannot observe a Stone Age awakening directly, the physical traces of shared fire and clustered sleeping areas imply a setting in which segmented sleep would be not only possible but functional. The spatial evidence does not prove a strict three-phase schedule, yet it complements biological and historical arguments. It reveals that ancient nights were socially structured spaces where darkness, closeness, and environmental variability would naturally interact with the brain's cyclical architecture. In this alignment between material remains and biological rhythm, the plausibility of phased sleep deepens. Within these hearth-centered spaces, the arrangement of bodies likely reflected both social bonds and practical needs. Archaeological reconstructions of Stone Age camps often show sleeping areas positioned in arcs around the fire, not scattered randomly across the landscape. Such positioning maximized warmth while keeping some view toward the surrounding area. The fire created gradients of light and temperature. Those closest experienced greater heat and illumination, while those farther away rested in dimmer, cooler zones. This uneven distribution would subtly influence how deep people slept. Individuals nearer the fire might wake more frequently as embers shifted or sparks cracked, while those at the edge might wake in response to colder air or distant sounds. Variation in the small environment within the same campsite could therefore produce variation in sleep timing without any deliberate coordination. Over thousands of nights across generations, this variation would form a natural mosaic of wakefulness. Archaeological layers of ash and charcoal suggest that fires were not allowed to burn out completely during the night. Maintaining embers would have required occasional stirring, particularly in colder climates during the later Ice Age. If all members of a group were fully unconscious for long, uninterrupted periods, the fire could die down to the point of going out, increasing vulnerability to cold or predators. A phased sleep structure with overlapping awakenings offers a simple behavioral solution. No formal guard rotation is necessary when sleep cycles are naturally staggered. From a demographic perspective, human groups included babies who woke to feed, teenagers with later circadian tendencies, adults in their physical prime, and older people whose sleep was lighter and more fragmented. These life stage differences are well documented in modern sleep research and are unlikely to be recent developments. In ancestral camps, such diversity would spread alertness across the night. Even brief awakenings lasting a few minutes would provide chances to check the fire, listen to the surroundings, or adjust coverings. The archaeological absence of defensive fortifications in many open-air sites suggests reliance on vigilance rather than heavy barriers. Stone tools and food remains cluster near hearths, indicating that evening activities happened in the same space later used for rest. This continuity blurs the boundary between waking and sleeping. Night was not a sealed interval separate from life. It was an extension of communal space under reduced light. Environmental pressures further shaped this dynamic. In Ice Age Europe, longer winter nights would increase the likelihood of segmented rest. Darkness extending beyond physiological need raises the probability of waking after initial deep sleep, rather than forcing the body into prolonged unconsciousness. Ancestral humans likely adjusted their behavior to these long nights. Quiet conversation, tool repair under low light, or simple stillness could fill the interval before returning to rest. Such activities would leave minimal archaeological trace. Yet the spatial logic of hearth-centered camps supports their possibility. Over approximately 200,000 years, Homo sapiens inhabited diverse climates. Yet the central role of controlled fire remained constant. This shared feature connects African grasslands and Eurasian plains. The combination of fluctuating light, communal closeness, and environmental unpredictability aligns with a phased architecture of sleep. Archaeology cannot measure melatonin or cortisol in ancient bones, but it reveals living spaces in which complete simultaneous unconsciousness would be improbable. The physical layout of a camp suggests nights made up of subtle movements and overlapping rhythms rather than uniform stillness. In this interplay between material evidence and biological cycles, the three-phase model gains further grounding in the real structure of prehistoric life. Across the long span of human evolution, nighttime was not only a biological event, but a social condition. Archaeological traces of repeated habitation show that certain campsites were occupied season after season, sometimes for generations. In these locations, the placement of hearths became more deliberate over time, suggesting learned patterns of nighttime organization. The hearth often sits at the center, with stone fragments, bone remains, and discarded tools spreading outward. This outward arrangement implies that activities flowed inward toward warmth and light. When evening settled, the same spatial logic would guide rest. People did not withdraw into isolated compartments. They remained within a shared field of awareness. In such an arrangement, even minor movements would be detectable by others nearby. A cough, the shifting of a sleeping mat, or the soft crackle of fuel would register within a small circle. This mutual awareness does not require full wakefulness. Light sleep, with its lowered threshold for sensory input, would be enough to maintain a sense of the group's condition. The absence of architectural barriers in most Stone Age settings reinforces this interpretation. Without walls or doors separating sleepers, the night remained open. Temperature changes further shaped the hours of darkness. As embers cooled and outside air temperatures dipped, the small climate within the campsite changed. Archaeological sediment layers show cycles of ash buildup mixed with packed earth, indicating ongoing fire management rather than abandonment until morning. The need to sustain warmth in colder regions of Eurasia during the Upper Stone Age would have made this maintenance even more important. It is hard to imagine that a small group could rely on one continuous block of collective unconsciousness under such conditions. Instead, a pattern of overlapping rest becomes more believable from the perspective of population structure. This arrangement would work without any explicit coordination. Young children who are prone to waking might stir early in the night. Older adults, whose sleep becomes lighter with age, might wake before dawn. Adults in their physical prime might experience deeper early sleep, but lighter phases later. These predictable biological differences would spread alertness across the dark hours. Archaeology also reveals that some camps included subtle spatial differences, with certain areas showing heavier or more compacted surfaces consistent with repeated lying down. Yet even these areas remain within sight and hearing of the hearth. The spatial design suggests collective rest built into communal space. Over roughly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens moved through varied ecosystems, from African grasslands to Levantine corridors and European plains. While climate and wildlife shifted, the basic reliance on fire and group closeness remained consistent. The archaeological record therefore supports a model of night that is structured but dynamic. It shows human groups as connected units whose rest unfolded within shared environmental conditions. This material evidence does not declare that sleep happened in exactly 3 equal phases. Yet it places human biology within a setting where segmentation would be adaptive rather than disruptive. The camps themselves, with their central fires and clustered sleeping zones, become silent evidence of nights that were neither fully awake nor fully asleep all at once. In the interplay between cooling embers, shifting bodies, and the vast darkness beyond the fire's glow, the structure of phased sleep fits naturally within the real conditions of prehistoric life. Sleep does not unfold identically across all ages of life. Even in modern populations, babies wake frequently, teenagers drift toward later bedtimes, adults settle into more stable patterns, and older individuals often rise earlier with lighter sleep. These differences are not products of industrial society. They reflect biological variation built into the human life cycle. If we project this variation back into Stone Age groups, the structure of nighttime becomes more complex and more adaptive. A small band of Homo sapiens 50,000 or 100,000 years ago would not have consisted solely of healthy adults in their physical prime. It would have included nursing babies, pregnant women, teenagers, mature adults, and older people. Each of these groups carries distinct sleep tendencies shaped by hormonal shifts, energy demands, and internal timing. In a setting without artificial light, these differences would express themselves freely. Babies wake to feed multiple times during the night, driven by nutritional need rather than environmental disturbance. Mothers or other caregivers would respond, creating pockets of wakefulness near the hearth. Teenagers, whose internal clocks naturally shift later during puberty, might stay alert longer into the early darkness and wake later toward dawn. Older adults who often experience less deep sleep and earlier morning awakenings would likely stir before sunrise. Adults in midlife might experience deeper early night sleep but still cycle into lighter phases as the hours passed. When these variations overlap within a small group, the result is not chaotic fragmentation but distributed vigilance. From an evolutionary standpoint, such a patchwork of sleep states offers collective advantage. Predation pressure during the late Ice Age was real, even if not constant. Large carnivores shared habitats with early humans. A group where all members entered deep sleep at the same time for extended periods would face greater vulnerability than one where alertness rotated naturally through age-based differences. Crucially, this distribution does not require conscious planning. It comes from ordinary biological diversity. Over roughly 200,000 years of Homo sapiens history, natural selection would have acted on individuals within this group setting. Traits that supported flexible transitions between sleep and wakefulness without excessive stress would persist. Older people, often valued for memory and experience, might have also served unintentionally as early risers who sensed environmental change. Teenagers staying awake slightly longer after dark could extend the period of group awareness into the early night. The sleeping community becomes a layered system rather than a uniform state. Anthropological observations of contemporary small-scale societies show similar diversity in sleep timing, though influenced by local conditions. These patterns suggest continuity rather than something new. When we imagine the night of our ancestors, it is tempting to picture everyone collapsing into sleep together. Yet demographic structure argues against such uniformity. Human groups have always contained multiple generations with different biological rhythms. In a long equatorial night lasting around 12 hours, these rhythms would naturally divide rest into phases across the group. What appears today as disrupted sleep may once have been an expression of cooperative survival. The variation built into human development from infancy through old age supports a model of night that is shared yet staggered. Within this framework, the idea that humans slept in multiple phases for much of their evolutionary past becomes not only believable but consistent with the biological diversity that defines our species. Demographic variation does more than scatter wakefulness randomly across the night. It shapes how responsibility and awareness circulate through a community without formal instruction. In small Stone Age groups, survival depended not on isolated individuals, but on the strength of the whole. Sleep therefore was embedded within a social organism. When an infant stirred in the early hours, the act of feeding did not happen in isolation from the group's awareness. The soft sounds of movement, the faint glow of stirred embers, and the shifting of bodies would ripple outward. Even if most members remained asleep, the threshold between sleep and wakefulness would soften. This subtle openness matters. Human sleep is rarely absolute. Even in deep stages, the brain keeps the capacity to process important signals, especially those related to family. Over evolutionary time, such responsiveness would support caring for children and group togetherness. Teenagers add another layer. Puberty shifts internal clock timing later, a pattern observed across cultures and independent of modern technology. In an ancestral camp, teenagers staying alert slightly longer after dark would extend the period of group activity around the fire. Storytelling, tool shaping, and social bonding often happen in these twilight hours. When teenagers eventually slept, their wakefulness might return closer to dawn, overlapping with older adults whose sleep lightens in the early morning. Older adults experiencing less deep sleep and earlier internal timing would likely rise before full sunrise. This early stirring aligns with a gradual rise in cortisol and body temperature that comes before daylight. In ecological terms, early risers provide advance notice of environmental change. A distant animal call, a shift in wind direction, or a drop in temperature would be noticed sooner. These patterns do not imply rigid roles, but show how biological diversity spreads awareness naturally. In higher latitudes, during Ice Age winters, nights could stretch beyond 14 hours. Under such extended darkness, the probability of phased sleep increases for all age groups. The first portion of the night might satisfy much of the body's drive for deep sleep. Later hours would become lighter and more fragmented. In such conditions, expecting uniform 8-hour consolidation becomes increasingly unrealistic. Instead, staggered phases would maintain continuity within the group. From a population perspective, this arrangement enhances resilience. If one member falls ill or experiences deeper sleep due to exhaustion, others remain available in lighter phases. Over the 2-year history of Homo sapiens, natural selection operated within these social clusters. Traits that supported flexible sleep, tolerance of nighttime awakenings, and rapid re-entry into rest would carry little disadvantage. The absence of fixed clocks or rigid morning obligations reduced the cost of nighttime wakefulness. A waking interval was not measured against productivity, but absorbed into the rhythm of communal life. Archaeological and ethnographic parallels suggest that such demographic layering persists wherever artificial lighting remains minimal. The structure of human development itself, from infancy to old age, ensures that no group ever shares identical internal timing. When placed within long nights shaped by natural darkness, this diversity produces a rotating pattern of awareness. In this sense, segmented sleep is not merely an individual phenomenon, but a collective property that comes from the interplay of age, biology, and environment across evolutionary time. When we widen the perspective from individual biology to long-term evolutionary stability, the implications of demographic layering become clearer. Homo sapiens survived not as solitary organisms, but as interdependent bands whose togetherness increased reproductive success. Night was one of the most vulnerable periods in this cycle. Vision diminished, temperatures dropped, and the risk of predation or environmental danger increased. Yet rather than developing a rigid system where certain individuals remained fully awake while others slept deeply, human groups appear to have relied on a subtler distribution of states. The natural variability in sleep timing across ages and individuals created a pattern where complete simultaneous unconsciousness was unlikely. This pattern would not require cultural enforcement. It would emerge automatically from biological diversity. Over approximately 200,000 years, such an arrangement would become part of the baseline expectation of night. Children whose sleep cycles are shorter and more fragmented would contribute brief periods of alertness throughout the dark hours. Caregivers responding to them would remain lightly awake, then return to rest. Teenagers with delayed circadian phases would stretch the waking edge of evening. Older adults whose sleep tends to be lighter and earlier in timing would form the early morning boundary before sunrise. Adults in midlife would anchor the initial deep portion of the night. Together, these layers form a continuum rather than a synchronized block. In evolutionary terms, this continuum enhances group security without incurring the energy cost of sustained wakefulness for any one member. Full vigilance throughout the night would be energetically expensive. On the other hand, fragmented overlapping awareness is more efficient. From the perspective of environmental adaptation, this structure aligns with the conditions in which early humans lived. In equatorial Africa, where Homo sapiens originated, nights remained relatively consistent in length across seasons. The availability of darkness exceeded the minimum duration needed for physical recovery. After several hours of deep sleep, the body's need for slow-wave activity diminishes. Additional hours of darkness create opportunity for phased rest rather than continuous unconsciousness. In colder Ice Age climates, extended winter nights would magnify this effect. Demographic variation ensures that as the strongest sleep pressure eases, someone within the group is likely to enter a lighter phase over evolutionary time. Such resilience would reduce the risk associated with nighttime threats. Importantly, there is no evidence that the human brain evolved ways to eliminate nighttime awakenings entirely. On the contrary, the persistence of brief arousals across modern sleep studies suggests that complete consolidation was never absolute. What changed in recent centuries was not human biology, but the social environment that interprets wakefulness as dysfunction. When industrial schedules require fixed morning performance, any deviation from uninterrupted sleep is labeled as a deficit. Yet for most of our species' history, night unfolded without clocks, alarms, or artificial illumination compressing darkness within that long context. A community structured by age-based differences would naturally experience phased sleep as a collective rhythm. The continuity of human development stages across millennia implies that this pattern is not accidental. It reflects the integration of biology and social living under natural light conditions. If humans slept in 3 phases across much of evolutionary time, the explanation may lie not in isolated individuals, but in the layered composition of the group itself, sustained over the vast arc of our shared past. Fire altered the human relationship with night, but it did not erase darkness. When early Homo sapiens learned to control flame, they extended the boundary of visibility only slightly. A hearth cast a warm, flickering glow that lit up faces, tools, and the ground immediately around it. Beyond that circle, shadow remained thick. Unlike modern electric lighting, firelight changes constantly in intensity and direction. It produces low levels of short-wavelength blue light, which is the part of the light spectrum that is most powerful in stopping melatonin production. As a result, the biological signal of night remained largely intact, even when fire was present. The circadian system continued to interpret the environment as dark. This distinction matters. Artificial light, especially from LEDs and screens, can significantly delay melatonin release and shift internal clocks. Fire, by contrast, offers warmth and limited visibility without fully changing the hormone landscape of the brain. For approximately 200,000 years of Homo sapiens history, firelight would have been the main source of light at night. Its qualities shaped how evenings unfolded. Social interaction extended beyond sunset, yet not indefinitely. The flicker of flame encourages closeness. People gather near to share heat and conversation. As fuel runs low and embers settle, activity slows. The gradual dimming of light signals the body to shift toward rest. Because fire does not maintain constant brightness, it cannot keep people alert the way electric bulbs can. The nervous system remains sensitive to the overarching presence of darkness from a biological perspective. This creates a layered night. The initial period after dark may involve extended wakefulness around the hearth. Once individuals lie down, the low-light environment allows melatonin to rise and cool body temperature to fall. Deep sleep follows naturally in the early hours. Yet as embers cool and outside temperatures drop further, subtle shifts occur. The body, having discharged much of its accumulated sleep pressure, may enter lighter stages. A person might wake briefly to a fuel or adjust position. Because the light source remained weak and warm in color, the hormone environment stays aligned with nighttime physiology. Going back to sleep is relatively effortless. This interplay between firelight and physiology supports a phase structure rather than a rigid block. Archaeological evidence shows that controlled fire was widespread among Homo sapiens and some earlier hominins. Hearth remains found in sites across Africa and Eurasia show repeated use over tens of thousands of years. The central placement of these hearths suggests that nighttime activity clustered around them. Yet there is no indication that fire turned night into day. The radius of illumination was limited and maintaining fuel required effort. Darkness still dominated the majority of the landscape. Over evolutionary time, This limited extension of evening light would reinforce the body's natural rhythms rather than override them. The presence of fire enabled storytelling, tool preparation, and social bonding after sunset. But it did not eliminate the biological architecture of sleep cycles. Instead, it introduced a gentle modulation, a transition from communal wakefulness to early deep sleep, followed by intervals of lighter awareness as the night progressed. Within this framework, three-phase sleep emerges not as a rigid schedule, but as an adaptive response to partial illumination. Fire provided warmth and security without abolishing the signals of darkness that govern circadian timing. In the long arc of human evolution, the glow of flame-shaped evenings, yet it preserved the underlying structure of night that had guided mammalian sleep long before humans gathered around embers. Although fire extended the usable portion of the evening, it also came with limits that preserved the depth of night. A hearth required constant tending. Fuel had to be gathered during daylight, dried, and arranged so that flames would not burn out too quickly. This practical limitation meant that nighttime illumination was finite. When embers dimmed, darkness came back. The human eye, adapted for daylight vision, does not work with precision in low light. Peripheral awareness improves, yet fine detail disappears. Under such conditions, prolonged complex activity becomes inefficient. The nervous system responds accordingly. As light levels fall, the retina sends signals that reinforce melatonin production, unlike electric light, which can maintain stable brightness for hours. Firelight fluctuates and gradually declines unless actively fed. This instability acts as a biological cue rather than a disruption. Over the course of evolutionary time, Homo sapiens would have internalized the pattern of fading illumination as a signal to transition toward rest. Yet the presence of embers ensured that complete darkness was rare within the immediate campsite. This partial light created a subtle boundary between waking and sleep. The early segment of the night likely involved deeper sleep when flames were still present, but social activity had stopped. As fuel ran low and temperatures reached their lowest point, lighter sleep phases would emerge. Individuals waking briefly might check the fire's condition or listen for unusual sounds. Because the light source remained weak and warm in color, the hormonal environment stayed aligned with nighttime physiology. Going back to sleep did not require overcoming bright stimuli. Archaeological sites across Africa and Eurasia reveal evidence of repeated fire use dating back tens of thousands of years. In many of these locations, the hearth is centrally positioned, with stone fragments and organic remains spread outward. This spatial arrangement suggests that the hearth served as both a practical tool and a social anchor. Nighttime behavior likely revolved around it. However, the limited radius of illumination meant that beyond the circle of warmth lay expansive darkness. Predators and other animals remained active in this zone. The awareness of this boundary would influence how deeply and uniformly a group could sleep. A phase structure where some individuals entered lighter states while others remained in deeper stages aligns well with this ecological reality. The biological systems that regulate sleep evolved under natural cycles long before the mastery of fire. Fire changed these cycles gently rather than replacing them. It allowed conversation after sunset and reduced exposure to cold, yet it did not eliminate the gradual fall in body temperature or the swings of sleep stages. Over approximately 200,000 years, the interaction between controlled flame and circadian rhythm became a stable feature of human nights. The result was neither continuous vigilance nor uninterrupted unconsciousness, but a layered pattern responsive to both embers and environment. In this context, three-phase sleep reflects the balance between extended evening light and the enduring authority of darkness. Fire shaped the tempo of night without overriding the biological architecture inherited from earlier mammals. Fire did more than provide light and warmth. It structured time without formal measurement. In a world without clocks, the rise and fall of flames marked transitions in collective behavior. Evening began with active tending, the stacking of wood, and the preparation of food. As the fire stabilized, conversation softened. When fuel diminished and embers settled into a steady glow, bodies reclined. These stages were visible and shared. The hearth became a time anchor around which sleep unfolded. Yet because fire required periodic renewal, it also created natural interruptions. A person waking during the night might notice that the glow had weakened or that smoke drifted differently. With shifting wind, such observations would prompt small adjustments. These movements were practical rather than disruptive. They occurred within the biological framework of sleep cycles that already divided the night into segments over evolutionary time. The coexistence of fire and circadian rhythm likely reinforced a phase structure rather than compressing it. Unlike electric lighting, which can hold darkness back for many hours, fire demanded participation. Its maintenance wove brief wakefulness into the rhythm of night. In colder climates during the Upper Stone Age, the need to sustain warmth intensified this dynamic. Archaeological deposits from Ice Age Europe show thick accumulations of charcoal and ash, indicating repeated fueling, even in the late hours. Continuous deep sleep across all members would risk letting embers fade, exposing the group to cold. Yet no evidence suggests rigid guard systems. Instead, the variability naturally built into human sleep combined with the visible cue of a declining flame would distribute responsibility organically from a physiological perspective. The presence of low, warm spectrum light maintains a nighttime hormone environment. Melatonin suppression remains minimal, and the suprachiasmatic nucleus continues to interpret the broader darkness as night. This preserves the swing between deeper and lighter stages. The first phase of sleep may align with a period shortly after. Flames are stabilized. The middle interval could coincide with partial amber decline when some members wake lightly to tend the fire. The final segment emerges as dawn approaches and body temperature begins its natural rise. In this model, fire acts not as a disruptor but as a modulator. It shapes the timing of transitions without abolishing them. For approximately 200,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, this interplay between flame and physiology repeated nightly across continents. From African grasslands to Eurasian plains, the hearth anchored communal rest. The limitations of fire, its dependence on fuel, its uneven brightness, its warmth fading with time, ensured that darkness retained authority. Sleep therefore unfolded in layers, responsive to both biological cycles and the visible state of embers. When later technologies introduced stable, bright illumination, this delicate balance shifted. But within the long arc of human evolution, the glow of fire preserved a night structured by phases, rather than flattened into a single block. The persistence of sleep cycles within a firelit world suggests that segmented rest was not a fragile exception, but a durable alignment between environment and nervous system, sustained over millennia. The transition from mobile foraging to settled agriculture did not happen overnight, and it did not immediately transform the structure of sleep. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across landscapes in response to seasonal resources. Around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, in several regions, communities began growing plants and domesticating animals. This shift introduced new rhythms into daily life. Fields required attention at specific times. Herded animals needed protection and regular care. Storing surplus food created responsibilities that went beyond immediate consumption. Yet even in early farming villages, artificial light remained limited to fire, oil lamps, or simple torches. Darkness still defined the boundaries of night. What changed gradually was the social organization of time. In mobile bands, activity responded mainly to environmental cues such as daylight, weather, and animal movement. In early farming communities, tasks became more scheduled. Planting and harvesting followed seasonal cycles, and labor demands intensified during certain periods. When work began, although sunrise remained the primary signal, social agreement about collective effort grew stronger. This subtle shift in how time was structured began to squeeze the flexibility of night. When communities settled permanently, architectural forms changed. Houses with defined walls and smaller openings created more enclosed sleeping spaces compared to open-air camps or shallow shelters. While these structures did not eliminate sound or temperature fluctuation entirely, they reduced exposure to some environmental stimuli. Over generations, this increased enclosure could encourage slightly longer stretches of uninterrupted sleep. Yet the biological architecture of sleep cycles did not change. The circadian system still responded to natural light and dark cycles, and melatonin secretion remained governed by sunset and sunrise. In early farming villages without bright artificial illumination, evenings would still darken gradually. People likely went to bed earlier during winter and somewhat later during summer, reflecting seasonal daylight variation. The difference lay in the growing expectation of early morning productivity. Fields demanded labor soon after first light, particularly in warmer climates where midday heat limited activity. This expectation may have increased the perceived cost of prolonged nighttime wakefulness. If waking occurred in the middle of the night, Individuals aware of early obligations might feel subtle pressure to go back to sleep quickly. Even so, historical and observational evidence suggests that segmented sleep continued in many farming societies well into the medieval period. The adoption of agriculture did not immediately erase phased sleep. It changed its social context. Over roughly 200,000 years of human evolution, only the most recent fraction has been spent in agricultural settings. For the majority of that time, nights unfolded under open skies or lightly enclosed shelters with minimal scheduling pressure. The agricultural transition represents a narrowing of flexibility rather than a complete break. It marks the beginning of a gradual shift in how time was organized, not an abrupt biological redesign. Within this slow transformation, the seeds of consolidated sleep were planted, yet they required later technological developments to fully take root. The early farmer still lived within darkness governed by the sun, and the nervous system that shaped sleep remained fundamentally aligned with phased rest. As agricultural life became more established, the relationship between night and labor tightened. Farming required coordination beyond what mobile foraging bands typically needed. Sowing, irrigation, harvest, and animal care followed seasonal and daily rhythms that benefited from working together. Sunrise remained the dominant signal, yet communities increasingly organized themselves around shared schedules. In settled villages, the expectation that many individuals would begin work together at first light introduced subtle pressure on how the night was experienced. When dawn carried immediate obligation, the interval between sleep segments could begin to feel less neutral. Waking in the middle of the night no longer existed solely within ecological time. It existed within social time. Even so, darkness still governed the environment. Oil lamps and simple torches provided modest illumination, far weaker than modern lighting. Their use was limited by fuel availability and cost. Extended nighttime activity remained constrained. The majority of households likely reduced light as evening progressed, allowing melatonin levels to rise naturally. Under these conditions, the internal architecture of sleep cycles would continue to express itself. The first segment of sleep would follow the initial decline of light and body temperature. Later in the night, after slow-wave sleep pressure eased, lighter sleep and spontaneous waking would still occur. The difference lay in interpretation. In communities where morning tasks were pressing, individuals might view nighttime wakefulness through a lens of practicality rather than curiosity. The interval could be used for quiet preparation, prayer, or planning. Historical records from farming societies often describe nighttime as a layered period with defined yet flexible phases. This suggests that segmented sleep did not disappear with agriculture but adapted to its demands. Architectural changes also influenced sleep patterns. Houses built with thicker walls and smaller openings reduced exposure to wind and animal sounds. In colder regions, enclosed structures kept in heat, reducing the need for frequent tending of open fires during the night. This increased insulation could support longer stretches of undisturbed sleep for some members of the household. Yet even within enclosed dwellings, temperature changes and limited light maintain the broader signal of darkness. The circadian system remained tied to sunrise and sunset rather than to artificial brightness. Over the approximately 10,000 years since the first agricultural transitions, human biology has not undergone substantial change in its core sleep mechanisms. Evolution operates over longer timescales. What changed more rapidly was the cultural value placed on time. As settlements grew into towns and trade networks expanded, economic interdependence intensified. Shared expectations about punctuality and early labor became more pronounced. This gradual social compression began to narrow the space in which phased sleep could unfold without consequence. Still, for much of recorded history before industrialization, references to first and second sleep persisted. The agricultural era represents a transitional zone. It neither fully preserved the fluidity of Stone Age nights, nor imposed the strict consolidation of modern industrial life. Instead, it introduced incremental pressures that slowly reshaped how people perceived and structured their rest. While the underlying biological rhythm of segmented sleep remained largely intact beneath these emerging social frameworks, as agricultural societies grew into more complex settlements, time itself began to take on sharper edges. Villages expanded into towns and trade networks linked distant regions. With increasing interdependence came a growing emphasis on coordination. Markets opened at predictable hours. Religious gatherings were scheduled. Seasonal festivals marked specific calendar points. The measurement of time became more precise. Through the use of sundials, water clocks, and eventually mechanical clocks. Although these devices did not yet light up the night, they introduced a new way of thinking about its boundaries. Night was no longer only the absence of sunlight. It became a counted interval between obligations. This shift in thinking subtly changed how sleep was valued. In earlier hunter-gatherer settings, the night unfolded according to environmental cues. In farming towns, the night increasingly served as preparation for structured daytime roles. Even without bright artificial lighting, the mental weight of morning commitments could influence the experience of nighttime awakenings. When someone woke between sleep segments, awareness of scheduled tasks might encourage a quicker return to rest. The waking interval remained biologically possible, but its perceived neutrality diminished. Over centuries, this reorientation of time compressed the space in which phased sleep could feel ordinary. Architectural change reinforced this trend. Multi-room dwellings and shared urban housing created more private sleeping areas. These spaces reduced some environmental stimuli that once triggered brief awakenings. Thicker walls insulated against wind and sound. Windows were often shuttered at night, limiting exposure to moonlight. Although oil lamps and candles remained dim compared to modern bulbs, their use within enclosed rooms allowed evening activities to extend later than in open camps. As bedtime shifted gradually later, the available darkness before dawn shortened. This compression did not immediately erase segmented sleep, but it made consolidated sleep more common. Why? The late medieval period in parts of Europe, written references to first and second sleep coexisted with emerging urban routines. The two patterns overlapped during a transitional era. Over roughly 200,000 years of human existence, this period represents only a narrow slice. For the overwhelming majority of evolutionary time, sleep occurred in environments without precise timekeeping or extended artificial light. The agricultural and early urban phases introduced social forces that began reshaping nighttime expectations. Yet they operated on biology that had evolved under very different conditions. The circadian system remained calibrated to natural light and dark cycles. Melatonin secretion still responded mainly to sunset and sunrise. Sleep cycles continued their 90-minute oscillations. What shifted was the cultural framing of these cycles. Night became something to optimize for daytime efficiency. In this gradual transformation, the foundations were laid for a more consolidated model of rest, though not yet enforced by bright illumination or industrial labor schedules. The agricultural era therefore stands as a bridge between the fluid nights of deep prehistory and the tightly structured nights of the modern world. It narrowed the flexibility of sleep without fundamentally redesigning the biological architecture that had sustained phased rest across the long arc of human evolution. The decisive transformation of night did not arrive with agriculture alone. It accelerated with the widespread adoption of artificial illumination that was brighter, steadier, and more pervasive than fire. The introduction of gas lighting in the 18th and 19th centuries extended visible activity deep into the evening hours, particularly in urban centers. Streets that once fell into near darkness after sunset became partially illuminated. Shops stayed open longer. Social gatherings shifted later. When electric lighting followed, its intensity and convenience surpassed earlier technologies. Unlike oil lamps or fireplace fires, electric bulbs required no constant tending and produced stable brightness. This stability changed the relationship between human biology and darkness in a fundamental way. The circadian system, finely tuned to light exposure, interprets brightness as a signal of day. Blue wavelengths in particular stop melatonin production and delay the onset of sleepiness. Under electric light, the biological night begins later, even if the astronomical night remains unchanged. As bedtimes move closer to midnight or beyond, the total window of darkness before morning obligations narrows. In pre-industrial settings, a winter night might spend 12 or more hours, allowing room for phased sleep. In industrializing cities, artificial light compressed effective darkness into a shorter interval. When people delayed sleep onset but still needed to rise at fixed hours for factory work or school, the available time for rest shrank. This compression encouraged consolidation. There was less space for a calm waking interval between segments. Waking in the middle of the night now risked reducing total sleep below what was socially acceptable for daytime productivity. Over time, uninterrupted sleep became idealized as efficient and healthy, while segmented sleep was reframed as fragmented. Historical language reflects this change. References to first and second sleep diminished as artificial lighting spread. By the late 19th century, medical literature increasingly described nighttime awakenings as disturbances. The shift did not coincide with any rapid evolutionary change. In the human brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus remained the same structure it had been for tens of thousands of years. Sleep cycles continued their internal oscillations. What changed was the environmental signal saturating those systems. Electric light, unlike fire, filled enclosed rooms with consistent brightness. It eliminated the gradual dimming that once guided the descent into sleep. Evening became extendable at will. Industrial schedules reinforced this transformation. Factories operated on fixed timetables requiring synchronized arrivals. Alarm clocks entered households, anchoring morning to mechanical sound rather than sunrise. Night was no longer an open interval governed by environmental cues, but a bounded segment between workdays. Within this framework, the middle waking phase lost its place. The cultural story shifted toward maximizing continuous rest within a compressed time frame. Over roughly 200,000 years of Homo sapiens history, this transformation occupies only the most recent fraction. For nearly all prior generations, darkness arrived without bright interruption. The biological architecture supporting phased sleep evolved under those conditions. The spread of artificial illumination did not erase that architecture. It placed new constraints on top of it. In the glow of gas lamps and electric bulbs, the ancient rhythm of three-phase sleep encountered a world that increasingly demanded consolidation. As electric lighting became common in homes rather than confined to streets and factories, the internal landscape of night changed further. Bedrooms that once relied on candles or embers were now lit by switches that produced immediate brightness. The boundary between evening and day grew blurry. Individuals could read, work, or socialize under steady illumination long after sunset, without the physical effort required to maintain a flame. This convenience changed behavior gradually, but profoundly. When light stays present into late hours, the circadian system delays its nighttime cascade. Melatonin secretion begins later. Core body temperature falls later, and the first large phase of deep sleep shifts accordingly. Yet social obligations, work schedules, school hours, and coordinated transport often remained fixed to early morning. The result was a narrowing of total sleep opportunity. In such compressed nights, the biological tendency toward phased rest met resistance. After 4 or 5 hours of sleep, the homeostatic drive for deep slow-wave activity diminishes. In earlier centuries, with abundant darkness remaining, this shift could open a calm waking interval before a second sleep. Under electric light conditions, however, that same waking interval often feels costly. If an individual falls asleep near midnight and must rise at 6, a spontaneous awakening at 3 reduces total rest to a level perceived as insufficient. The waking phase becomes a threat to productivity rather than a neutral pause. Psychological interpretation begins to change physiological experience. Worry about insufficient sleep can activate the stress response, making it harder to return to rest. Over time, cultural expectations solidify. Medical thinking in the 20th century increasingly defined normal sleep as a continuous block of 7 to 8 hours. Nighttime awakenings were framed as symptoms needing correction. This reframing happened without any evidence that human biology had been redesigned. The same suprachiasmatic nucleus, the same 90-minute sleep cycles, and the same temperature patterns continued. What shifted was the environmental intensity of light and the economic structure surrounding time. Artificial illumination also extended seasonal uniformity. In pre-industrial settings, winter nights were longer, summer nights shorter, and sleep patterns adjusted accordingly. Electric light reduced seasonal variation in behavior. Evening activity remained similar across months, smoothing out differences that once shaped nighttime structure. Over roughly 200,000 years of human evolution, such uniformity is unprecedented. For most of our species' history, the nervous system adapted nightly to real darkness. The disappearance of segmented sleep from common experience aligns with this environmental flattening. When light fills interior space until moments before bedtime, the descent into sleep is abrupt rather than gradual. The layered architecture of night becomes compressed into a single socially endorsed interval. The phased capacity may still exist biologically, but it has less opportunity to express itself. In this sense, electric light did not eliminate the ancient rhythm, it crowded it. The middle waking window, once embedded within long darkness, now competes with shortened sleep opportunity and fixed schedules. The transformation is technological and cultural rather than evolutionary. Yet its impact on nightly experience is profound. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, night in industrial societies had become something fundamentally different. From the night that shaped human evolution, streets glowed, factories operated in shifts, and domestic interiors remained illuminated long after sunset. The boundary between day and night blurred, not only in brightness, but in expectation. Productivity no longer depended strictly on daylight. Work could continue under electric bulbs and leisure could stretch into late hours without the natural signal of fading flame. This shift introduced a new relationship between time and rest. Instead of aligning sleep with darkness, sleep increasingly aligned with the remaining gap between obligations when artificial light delays bedtime while fixed schedules maintain early rising. The body is required to squeeze its restorative processes into a shorter window. Within that window, the biological tendency toward phased sleep becomes inconvenient. If an individual wakes naturally after 4 or 5 hours, there may not be enough time left for a second extended segment. The ancient middle interval, once neutral or even useful, now competes with alarm clocks and social expectations. Over time, cultural stories adapt. Uninterrupted sleep is described as efficient, mature, and healthy. Fragmented sleep is portrayed as a defect. This reframing becomes embedded in medical education and public advice. Yet the underlying physiology stays continuous with the past. Sleep still unfolds in cycles. Core body temperature still reaches its lowest point in the middle of the night. Cortisol still rises before dawn. These internal oscillations did not disappear with the arrival of electricity. What changed was the environmental envelope containing them. Artificial light not only stops melatonin production, but also reduces exposure to the gradual transitions of dusk and dawn that once built the structure of night. In ancestral environments, darkness arrived slowly, deepened fully, and receded gradually. Electric lighting introduces abruptness. A room may remain bright until moments before sleep, then go dark with the flip of a switch. The nervous system must adjust rapidly rather than through late cues. Over roughly 200,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, such abrupt transitions are new. For nearly all prior generations, the descent into sleep followed extended dimming and cooling. The middle waking interval, embedded within long darkness, had room to exist without conflict. In the industrial era, that space contracted as cities expanded and digital screens later entered bedrooms. The compression intensified. Even the final segment of sleep, once guided by gradual light at dawn, is often interrupted by artificial alarms before natural cortisol peaks. The cumulative effect is a night streamlined for social efficiency rather than shaped solely by environmental cycles. The disappearance of common language about first and second sleep reflects this transformation. Segmented sleep did not vanish because the brain changed. It receded because the conditions that once supported it were replaced. The modern night is brighter, shorter, and more tightly scheduled. Within this altered framework, the ancient architecture of phased rest persists quietly beneath expectation. Its contours are visible only when artificial constraints are removed. When a person wakes at 2 or 3 in the morning today, the experience is often interpreted as malfunction. The room is dark, but not entirely silent. A faint glow from devices or street lights may linger at the edges. The mind, conditioned by modern expectations, begins to calculate the remaining hours before an alarm. Concern arises quickly. Yet, from a biological perspective, this awakening may represent a leftover expression of an older rhythm rather than a defect. The human nervous system still carries the same architecture that evolved under long stretches of natural darkness. Sleep cycles continue to swing in roughly 90-minute patterns. After several hours of deep, slow-wave sleep, the homeostatic pressure that initially drove rest diminishes. In ancestral environments where darkness extended well beyond that point, a calm interval of wakefulness could unfold without consequence. In modern settings where total sleep opportunity is compressed, the same awakening is seen as a disruption. The physiological mechanisms have not fundamentally changed. Melatonin secretion still rises in the evening and gradually falls toward morning. Core body temperature still reaches a low point during the night before climbing again. Cortisol still increases before dawn to prepare the body for activity. These oscillations can produce windows of lighter sleep in the middle hours, What is different now is the interpretive layer imposed by fixed schedules and productivity demands. When waking threatens to reduce total sleep below culturally prescribed norms, anxiety may amplify the state of alertness. The sympathetic nervous system activates, heart rate increases slightly, and going back to sleep becomes harder. This feedback loop is psychological and environmental rather than evolutionary from the perspective of our species' roughly 2,000-year history. Consolidated 8-hour sleep is a recent cultural standard. For most of that time, darkness was abundant and not tightly bounded by alarms or early commuting. In that context, waking between sleep segments would not necessarily reduce total restorative time. A second segment could follow naturally. Modern insomnia often reflects a mismatch between ancient biology and contemporary structure. This does not mean all sleep disorders are expressions of ancestral patterns. Many have complex causes, yet epidemiological studies show that brief nighttime awakenings are common even among individuals who report overall good sleep. The difference lies in perception and environment. In a compressed night shaped by electric light and early obligations, the middle waking interval becomes costly. In a long, unlit night, it could be neutral or integrated into the rhythm of rest. The body has not had enough evolutionary time to redesign its internal clock to match industrial timetables. Natural selection operates across millennia, not centuries. The persistence of spontaneous awakening suggests continuity with a past in which phased sleep carried little penalty. When viewed through this longer lens, modern nighttime wakefulness may represent not failure, but friction. Friction between a nervous system shaped in open darkness and a world illuminated and scheduled in ways that are unprecedented for most of human existence. Clinical definitions of insomnia often emphasize difficulty starting sleep, maintaining sleep, or going back to sleep after waking. These criteria are valuable for identifying distress and impairment. Yet when examined through an evolutionary lens, the boundary between disorder and variation becomes less rigid. Human sleep has always included brief arousals. Polysomnographic recordings show that even individuals who believe they sleep continuously experience multiple micro-awakenings each night, often lasting only seconds. These are typically forgotten by morning. The brain cycles upward from deeper stages toward lighter ones several times across the night. In ancestral environments where darkness remained long and unstructured by clocks, such arousals would pass without interpretation. Today, the same physiological event may trigger mental evaluation. The presence of visible time on a bedside clock or a phone screen introduces measurement into what was once a fluid interval. When someone wakes at 3:17 in the morning, the precise knowledge of elapsed hours reframes the experience. The mind calculates deficit rather than observing rhythm. This shift in interpretation can amplify wakefulness. Cognitive models of insomnia suggest that worry about sleep increases brain activation, making it harder to return to rest. The biological awakening, which might have been brief, becomes extended through rumination from the standpoint of Homo sapiens to our history. This interaction between thinking and timekeeping is recent. For most generations, waking in the middle of the night did not carry numerical awareness of last minutes. It unfolded within darkness without immediate social penalty. Environmental cues reinforced calmness. No bright screens stimulated the eyes. No alarm signaled imminent obligation. The nervous system, still within a nighttime hormone environment, could re-enter sleep with relative ease. The modern environment adds layers of stimulation. Even dim artificial light can suppress melatonin if exposure is prolonged. Checking a device introduces blue wavelengths that signal daytime to the brain. Noise pollution and indoor temperature regulation can further alter the sensory landscape. These factors interact with the ancient architecture of sleep cycles, sometimes exaggerating their boundaries. The result is not necessarily a new biological flaw, but a mismatch between inherited rhythms and modern stimuli. It is important to acknowledge that chronic insomnia can involve complex neurobiological and psychological factors requiring care. Yet, the widespread occurrence of middle-of-the-night awakening suggests that segmentation remains latent in the human system. Epidemiological studies show that a significant portion of adults report waking during the night at least occasionally. In earlier centuries, this might have aligned with a recognized second sleep. In the present, it is often labeled as maintenance insomnia. The shift in terminology reflects cultural framing rather than a documented evolutionary transition. When sleep is compressed into a narrow window between late bedtimes and early alarms, the natural rise and fall of alertness becomes more visible and more costly. In this compressed frame, the body's remaining tendency toward phased rest can appear as dysfunction. Viewed across the full arc of human history, however, nighttime waking may represent continuity rather than deviation. If we place modern nighttime wakefulness against the full evolutionary timeline of our species, its meaning begins to shift. For roughly 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived without exposure to stable, bright illumination after sunset. Nights were long, acoustically alive, and thermally variable. Within that environment, the brain evolved to cycle through stages of deep and light sleep without the expectation of uninterrupted duration. The oscillation itself was the norm. What we now call sleep maintenance was simply part of the architecture. When darkness exceeded the minimum requirement for physical recovery, waking between segments did not necessarily reduce total sleep. A second period of rest could follow naturally before dawn. In the modern world, this biological rhythm operates within a compressed container. Bedtimes are delayed by electric light, digital media, and social activity. Wake times are fixed by work, school, and synchronized transport. The window for sleep narrows often to 7 hours or less. Within that narrowed span, a spontaneous awakening after 4 or 5 hours takes up a significant portion of available rest. The same physiological event that once occurred within abundance now unfolds within scarcity. This difference alters perception. The awakening is no longer neutral. It becomes costly. Over time, repeated association between waking and anxiety can condition heightened arousal. The brain, anticipating disruption, may increase vigilance in subsequent nights. Yet the underlying cycles remain those inherited from earlier generations. The circadian clock still signals a trough of body temperature in the middle of the night and a gradual rise toward morning. REM sleep still increases in later cycles, making awakenings more likely closer to dawn. These internal patterns are continuous with our evolutionary past from a demographic perspective. The persistence of middle-of-the-night awakenings across cultures suggests stability, rather than something new. Even in societies with minimal artificial light, individuals report waking briefly. The difference lies in duration and interpretation. Without bright screens, rigid alarms, or strong mental pressure, going back to sleep may happen more easily. The modern environment makes the boundary between phases more pronounced. Over the long arc of human existence, natural selection did not eliminate this segmentation because it did not pose a consistent survival threat. On the contrary, within small groups living in darkness, distributed alertness may have offered subtle advantages. When viewed through this lens, modern experiences of nighttime wakefulness may represent friction between an ancient system and a recent structure. The nervous system shaped under open skies still cycles through its inherited rhythms. While the industrial world demands consolidation and efficiency, this tension does not make the distress of those struggling with sleep any less real, but it does reframe the origin of some awakenings. They may not signal defect, but continuity.